Churches across the country have been targeted in a series of vandalism or arson attacks following the discovery of unmarked graves near residential schools operated by the Catholic Church.
Hello and welcome to The Nexus. Today we're looking at a very disturbing story coming out of Canada. Over the past couple of months, dozens of churches have been vandalised, attacked and even burned to the ground. The assault on churches started after hundreds of unmarked graves were discovered in the grounds of 3 church-run residential schools. The schools were government-funded and run by the clergy and were tasked with assimilating Indigenous children into Canadian society. That went on for well over a century. Well, conditions were very hard and children died from various diseases and other causes at a far higher rate than in the general population. The discovery of the graves, a quarter of a century after the last residential school closed its doors, has shocked the nation.
This was an incredibly harmful government policy that was Canada's reality.
I remember them taking me away from my mother and my stepfather. My whole life really started to change.
The Roman Catholic Church had one purpose at one time. It was to brainwash my lineage.
My strongest memory there is when the little girl died beside me. She must have been about 6.
They just didn't bother keeping track of children who died. I think that's unacceptable.
Remains of up to 215 children who've been found in unmarked graves.
Hundreds of unmarked graves at the site of another former residential school.
751 unmarked graves.
The remains of 182 bodies in unmarked graves near the former St. Eugene's Mission School.
Canadians today are horrified and ashamed of how our country behaved. We are sorry.
As Canada has this moment of reckoning over residential schools, anger directed towards the Catholic Church has been growing.
2 Catholic churches burned to the ground ahead of National Indigenous Day.
2 more Catholic churches burned to the ground.
This statue of Pope John Paul II was vandalized.
Churches across the country have been targeted in a series of vandalism or arson attacks following the discovery of unmarked graves near residential schools operated by the Catholic Church.
There is deep sadness in the First Nations community, indeed amongst all of Canadians, I hope, at this terrible discovery of the sins of our past.
That anger is not going to go away. And this is the result of the anger.
Well, the anger is understandable, but in many cases, the targeted churches have nothing to do with residential schools. In fact, some Indigenous Christians have been deeply hurt by the attacks on their places of worship. Here's a snippet from a Canadian news report.
No matter if this is just a building, it's something that means to everybody in this village.
Rosalind Daniels and her family could feel the heat on their skin as fire destroyed an Anglican church across the street from their home, a place their community has gathered for over 130 years.
When my children seen that, they were just so heartbroken because they have so many memories in that church.
Meanwhile, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who says he's a Catholic, has also made it clear that attacking churches is unacceptable.
So I understand the anger that's out there, against the federal government, against institutions like the Catholic Church. It is real, and it is fully understandable given the shameful history that we're all becoming more and more aware of and engaging ourselves to do better as Canadians. But I can't help but think that burning down churches is actually depriving people who are in need of grieving and healing and mourning from places where they can actually grieve and reflect and look for support.
Of course, while decrying the attacks on churches, Trudeau is also asking the leader of the world's Catholics to apologise, as he did to Indigenous people. Pope Francis has expressed his shock and sorrow, but has not yet apologised.
Seguo con dolore le notizie che giungono dal Canada circa la sconvolgente scoperta dei resti di 215 bambini alunni. Questi momenti difficili rappresentano un forte richiamo per tutti noi, per allontanarci dal modello colonizzatore e anche delle colonizzazioni ideologiche di oggi e camminare fianco a fianco nel dialogo, nel rispetto reciproco e nel riconoscimento dei diritti e dei valori culturali di tutte le figlie e i figli del Canada.
Now, while the unmarked graves discovered this year have shocked Canada, the country established a Truth and Reconciliation Commission looking into residential schools back in 2008. The commission was launched under the previous Canadian Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, and it gave former pupils an opportunity to share their experiences with the nation. It culminated in a comprehensive report which was published in 2015. Here is Stephen Harper announcing the commission and apologising for the Canadian government's role in residential schools.
Mr. Speaker, I stand before you today to offer an apology to former students of Indian residential schools. Two primary objectives of the residential school system were to remove and isolate children from the influence of their home, families, traditions, and cultures, and to assimilate them into the dominant culture. These objectives were based on the assumption that Aboriginal cultures and spiritual beliefs were inferior and unequal. Indeed, some sought, as was infamously said, to kill the Indian in the child. The Indian Residential Schools Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This commission represents a unique opportunity to educate all Canadians on the Indian residential schools system. It will be a positive step in forging a new relationship between Aboriginal peoples and other Canadians.
Well, that was over a decade ago, and still this story has the power to shock. Let's bring in our guest now. And we're joined by Jean Teye, who is a lawyer and defender of Indigenous rights. She also belongs to the Métis people and is a great-grandniece of the famed Métis leader, Louise Riel. We also have Geraldine Lee Shingoose, who attended one of Canada's residential schools back in the 1960s and 70s. And finally, we have Chris Alexander, the former immigration minister during the previous Conservative government under Stephen Harper. Thank you and welcome to all of you. Jean Teye, if I could start with you. As we've heard, Canada's been dealing with the residential school scandal for years. Why is it you think that these unmarked graves have only just been discovered in the last couple of months?
Well, discovery is an interesting word. The fact is that Indigenous people have known about them forever. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that published its report, I think in 2015, they reported on it. So it's not that this is a secret that's been lying in plain sight for over 50 years at least. So it's just come to attention because of the recent revelation, rather than discovery, I would use, of the grave sites in Kamloops and now in Saskatchewan, but there are many, many more.
And do you sense that there was a reluctance to bring these to the public's attention? Any sort of cover-up? Any attempt at putting the past in the past, so to speak?
Well, I think that's a standard story for most Indigenous issues, is to treat them as what I think I'll quote our Prime Minister as a sorry chapter in our history, as if it's 100 years ago. But that's not true. The last residential school closed, I think, in 1997. So this is history that's certainly in my lifetime, and it's not history. It's not in the past. It's still here. But Canadians have a wonderful way of reinventing themselves in a sort of virginal, innocent manner, and we're very good at recreating our image as nice Canadians.
Yeah.
And we're very good at that, and the whole world buys that.
Although you are also keen to make sure that these are not represented as mass graves, as they have been described, but graveyards full of unmarked graves. Why are you at pains to draw that distinction?
Well, I think it's very important. This is a shocking story. We don't know the total numbers of children who are buried in these graves, but it's very important that we not confuse this with, say, Rwanda, where you find a grave with hundreds of people in it. These are cemeteries. They're not a mass grave. So this isn't a singular event. It's an ongoing deaths of children who are buried. Some of them were in marked graves and those markings were taken away. Some of them appear to be in graves that were never marked. Some of them were marked, but their names were never on them. So, I would say to your public who's watching this, did your elementary school have a cemetery attached to it? And that's an important question.
To the outside world, sometimes the headlines just give the impression that these schools were in some way involved, not in just cultural genocide, but in genocide. That's not the case. Is that right? The children who died generally died because the conditions were poor and it wasn't intentional.
Well, I think we can talk about what intention is, but if you are deliberately raising children and not giving them enough calories to live on, that's you can talk about whether that's just a slow death or whether that is whether that's intention to cause harm. That's a very interesting question. I would not put that brush on every residential school, but there's enough examples of the horrible treatment, of the physical abuse, of the starvation of some of these children. So there's, what is the church doing? What were they doing?
Can I ask you, Jean, some people have said that to look at something that went on for over a century, which spanned, Dickensian period when, for example, in England, there were workhouses, poorhouses, debtors' prisons, and so on, and you have to see it in context. You cannot have an anachronistical view of it, and that there were some good intentions. Do you see any of that, or is it just too small to even take into account?
I think that in some cases the intention. So let's put it this way: the Canadian government and the churches thoroughly believe that what they were doing in eradicating the Indian out of the child, they believed that what they were doing was good and necessary and the right thing to do. That's what they believed. So you can put that in the context of the time if you want, but there were plenty of voices telling them at the time that this was wrong and that children were dying and that this was a terrible practice. So there were voices all along who were speaking the truth here. Now, only if you look at this as something 100 years ago, Dickensian, can you say, well, it's just a product of its time. But remember, these were in 1990s. They were still running. So you can't say that anymore. I think that is just an excuse for maltreatment of children.
May I bring in Geraldine now? Geraldine, you were at a residential school in the 60s and the 70s. The horror stories we're hearing, does this bear any resemblance to what you experienced?
Yes, it truly varies the experience. My residential school experience, I attended Muskogee Residential School for 9 years, 10 months out of the year. My experience in these schools were very traumatic, horrific. I experienced physical abuse where I experienced hearing loss. Like I don't have, I wear hearing aids today because of the punches and the blows to the head on a daily basis, and for speaking my language, and for I don't speak my language today because of the beatings and the straps for speaking my language.
And was that the intention, to estrange you, to separate you from your culture?
Yes, that was the full intention of the government and the church, the Catholic Church, where I went to in Muskogee School, was to take that language out of me.
Chris Alexander, Justin Trudeau has addressed this, but in fact, and apologised, but in fact it was under the Stephen Harper government that we saw the Truth and Reconciliation Committee and Commission started. And it was under him that the first apology on behalf of the Canadian government was issued. Can you explain why Stephen Harper did that at that time, and what was the significance of it?
Well, it was 2008. I was not in the House of Commons when it happened, but it was a very moving occasion, which is remembered in this country. And it was done because it was the right thing to do and recommended by the Commission, by victims, by everyone involved in the process of uncovering the truth about the trauma that this network of schools had inflicted on generations of Indigenous people. But that apology was supposed to only be the beginning of a plan of action to address and make amends for this criminal policy that existed for over a century in this country. It's not just the lives that were lost and the culture and language that was lost. It was the systematic disruption of family life, extended family life, bands, clans, tribes, communities across the country. Children were ripped out of their families and therefore knew nothing other than the kind of treatment that Geraldine described. And so when they went back to those communities and went back to life, sometimes in urban Canada, they had all the problems that you would expect people who'd been through such trauma to have. And they are the victims, the survivors of residential schools, prominent in the child welfare system. They are prominent in other categories of life in Canada that need support.
Right, so this goes on, as you were saying, Chris, this goes on. It has effects today on Indigenous people to this day. Let me ask you about Justin Trudeau. He apologised. He just went to visit the gravesite, and he does appear to be a very empathetic character. On the other hand, over the last couple of years, we've seen Indigenous people say, especially about the pipeline, the big Keystone pipeline, that he's betrayed them. And they say that he's patronising, he's a weak leader and a liar. Is all this display of sympathy and emotion political expediency, or does he mean it?
No, he means it. And it is important for all of us to be sincere, but it's also important to change our behavior, to change our policies, to change our direction as a country. And here I think he's let all of us down, because among the recommendations of the Commission was action to identify the children who are in these graves. And he's been in office for 5 years. That action didn't happen. Above and beyond that, we have a report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. There hasn't been action to implement its recommendations. Above and beyond that, we had a Royal Commission on Canada's Aboriginal peoples back in the 1990s. No government, including the one I was a part of, has done enough to implement those recommendations. We as a country are at a watershed moment because a policy we pursued for the better part of 2 centuries of assimilation of First Nations and Indigenous people was deeply wrong. It was never what Canada was meant to do. It was unjust. In some cases, it was criminal. We have to change direction in a deep and profound way and help Indigenous people restore their culture, their language, their prosperity, in some cases their mental health, their family life, all of which was broken by this terrible legacy.
Jean Thier, could I ask you about the other part of this story now, which is the attack on churches? The reports are that this is in response, direct response to these unmarked graves being discovered. Is there any evidence to support that, or is that just circumstantial?
Well, in other words, we have not caught anybody. No one's been charged. But you have, I think, I've heard reports of anywhere from 9 to 12 churches where either they've been burnt down to the ground or been set on fire. I don't think it's a coincidence that this is happening and they're on reserves. So, you know, I think the evidence that we know so far seems to lead us pretty conclusively to the fact that this is a reaction.
But some of these churches have nothing to do with the residential schools. Is that correct?
So we understand. I think it's the Catholic Church well, there's an Anglican church too, evidently. So it's the churches. And I think what it is that people have just changed targets. For generations, most Indigenous people have been fighting the government. And if you want to look at it this way, I think the way it's been seen is that the government is the puppet master and the churches were the actors. And so most of the leadership has been going after the government to try and get change. And it seems to me a lot of people are probably frustrated with that. And so they're going after the puppet, the church.
And there are Indigenous Christians who are very upset about their churches being burned down.
This is true. We're certainly hearing that across the country.
Does that mean that Indigenous people, Indigenous leaders in particular, are saying this is not the right way to go about it?
I think that that's what the leadership is saying. In fact, that's what we're hearing across the country, is we need to take action, but that's not the right way to do it.
Geraldine, when you see the churches being burned down, I'd just like to know, how do you feel about that? Does that give you satisfaction, or does it make you upset that sort of 2 wrongs don't make a right?
Well, I haven't been paying attention to the church burning. My focus is on the Catholic Church and seeking justice against the Catholic Church for all the wrongdoings, and then also for I just came from Kamloops Residential School. There's 215 children that are on that site. The leadership has the area burial site. Nobody could go in there. It's a crime scene. So I myself am seeking criminal justice. There needs to be an international investigation against the Catholic Church and the federal government of Canada. Like the federal government of Canada just recently, when they found out about the 215 and the 751, it was presented in the House of Commons that it was genocide. And they voted against it. The Liberal government voted against it, and the PC government voted against it. So, that's what we're seeking it's genocide that happened, to the residential school survivors and to these children that are found. But the leadership, Indigenous leadership doesn't agree with the church burning and the statues being torn down. But there's a shift that's happening, across Canada right now, across Turtle Island. There's youth that are standing up and they're not going to tolerate. Like I lived a residential school experience, and I came out of it. But the youth, they're more stronger. There's a shift, and if it's going to take violence, then they'll proceed with that violence. Like, you know, they're taking a stand. They're trying to protect the residential school survivors. They're seeing, their focus is on the children, the ones that are being found. Like, you know, a statue, you can't, like, you know, it doesn't mean anything. Those little lives, those precious lives mean a lot to us.
Geraldine Shingus, Chris Alexander, and Jean Teye, thank you all very much for your contributions to the Nexus today. Much appreciated. And thank you at home and on your phones for watching. Remember, if you want to see this or any of our previous episodes, do go to our channel on YouTube. Just type in Nexus TRT World. Till next week then, goodbye.